You are watching the RNL, the Revolution Nothing Less show. Today is July 23rd, 2020. My name is Sansara Taylor, and I'm here in studio with Luan. How you doing, Luan?
I'm all right, and you?
Very good. And Andy Zee, the host of our show. He'll tell you a little bit about this show.
All right, thank you, Sansara and Luan. Glad that we're all back together in the garage in California, Los Angeles. So welcome to the RNL Revolution Nothing Less show. This is a show about revolution, an actual revolution, to bring about a whole new system. At the core of the show, we understand and we bring to you why it is that this system can't be reformed and why only a revolution to overthrow this system and bring about a radically new system will bring about the kind of world that many, many millions of people yearn for. On this show, we bring to you how to know what the problem is in the world, how to understand all the complexity of the dangers of war, why the immigration stuff is happening, why they're being so vicious towards the immigrants, putting children in cages, the Black Lives Matter, the police killings, the unrelenting wars, and the devastation of our planet itself. Where does all this come from, and how do we understand it, and then what can we do about it? And the thing is, we wouldn't just be having a show, Revolution Nothing Less, if we didn't think that a revolution was actually possible, because people care about these things, and also because there is a way out of the madness. There is a strategy for an actual revolution, a strategy that could win, that we're going to work on right now and calling people to get involved with this revolution. And there's a blueprint for a radically new society. All of this has been developed by the leader, the revolutionary leader, who's a different kind of leader, Bob Avakian. Bob Avakian is not a politician. He's not looking to angle for some advantage here. Bob Avakian has gone to work over many decades to develop a way to understand the world, to change the world. He's studied the past revolutions. He's analyzed them. He's gone into various fields of human inquiry and developed a new communism, a new synthesis of the experience of the first revolutions. And this is about one thing. It's about how do we get to the emancipation of all of humanity. An extraordinary thing about this revolution and about this new communism, that it's not about the ends justify the means. It's not about revenge. It is, as I said, about the emancipation of humanity. So you're going to learn more about Bob Avakian through this show and through the succession of shows. You've got to be part of the community that's watching it. And as you get involved with the community around the Revolution Nothing Less show, you need to get organized into that movement. We are in a great race right now to organize people into the revolution, because we are facing extremely sharp times this fall with the elections, if there even is an election, if the president, that fascist pig Donald Trump, even honors the election. And all of this means that you need a force on the scene that is outside the box, that is going to work on the time when we can get rid of the system that gave rise to Donald Trump and everything else. But we have a really special show, a packed show, so I want to get right to that right now. And so maybe, Luan, you can tell people about what a sort of different kind of show we're planning for this week.
Yeah, so this episode, we're going to take some time and get into this question that's drawn out in the film, The Five Bloods. And we're actually going to be having a discussion between Andy, Carl Dix, who has been on the show, who you're going to learn more about, who's a revolutionary, and also a segment that's in conversation with David Zeiger, who's created some very key pieces on the American Crime series for this show and other episodes, and it also is the director of the film Sir No Sir, which is very important and key on this question of the Vietnam War and what did the vets actually do. So we're going to have a big conversation on this, and that's going to be taking up a lot of what we're actually going to be talking about in this episode of the show. And we also want to take a minute to draw people's attention to revcom.us, because this is the site that we're making the show in conjunction with, in connection with. So check it out, get into it.
We're going to be tying together themes we've been talking about over the last 6 weeks and 4 months of the show, the oppression of black people and the movement that's arisen in the last 6 weeks against that oppression in this country. We've been talking about, particularly in episodes 15 and 16 on the necessity of people to break with American chauvinism, American patriotism, believing America's a special place. All this will come through in discussing and critiquing this film by Spike Lee, Da 5 Bloods. It's streaming now on Netflix, and it's being heralded by people for reasons that, as this is telling the true story of the black GIs in the Vietnam War. But we're going to hear, through this conversation I have and through other film clips we're going to expose the true history of this war, particularly of the role of the black soldiers. We're going to bring out the truth of the rebellion of the soldiers, the revolutionary current among these soldiers, and the rebellion and revolutionary currents that developed in this country in response to this, as well as the having implications for the urgent need to prepare for revolution today. But before we get to the discussion of the film with my friends and colleagues and comrades, Carl Dix and the filmmaker David Zeiger, we want to begin with two short, very special segments. These are really important. And first, there's been a piece by Bob Avakian on the website RevCom called "Bloated Bag of Fascist Feces, Trump Isn't Tough," Part 2. Who really has heart? And this, what you're going to hear is Bob Avakian reading this piece that was first published on June 24th of this year, 2020, on the website. He's going to be reading it, and we're going to be doing some of what we do here, which is illustrating it with some imagery. And then after that's over, I'll tell you what comes next.
Bloated bag of fascist feces, Trump isn't tough. Part 2. Who really has heart? In Bloated Bag, Part 1, talking about bunker boy Donald Trump, who continues to threaten and is responsible for vicious repression against protesters, I made this point. Anybody can act tough when they are calling on a massive machinery of violence and destruction, like the U.S. military, to back them up. And I spoke to the fact that, in opposition to the coward bully Trump, the ones who are showing real courage and heart are the masses of people of all races and genders who have taken to the streets to demand an end to this brutality and murder, and have defied curfews and braved assaults from police and National Guard forces. If we go broader and deeper, beyond the confines of this country and the immediate time frame, we can see another shining example of people with real courage and heart going up against powerful oppressive forces. The Vietnamese people, who fought heroically and at the cost of great sacrifice to drive out their colonizing oppressors. As Malcolm X put it, these were a people of a poor nation who chased the French colonialists right out of their country. And then, after the U.S., which had backed the French colonialists in that war, took over directly and tried to dominate Vietnam, the revolutionary Vietnamese fighters, at the cost of great sacrifice, defeated the attempts of the most powerful military in the world to subjugate their country and forced it to withdraw. Unlike the U.S. military that slaughtered huge numbers of Vietnamese civilians, or the fundamentalist Islamic fanatics of these times, who also slaughter and seek to terrorize masses of innocent civilians, the Vietnamese were fighting a war of liberation by revolutionary means. Or, coming back to this country, if you want to talk about courage and heart, how about the Black Panther Party, which began with a small number of black youth who went on armed patrols, legally at the time, in Oakland in the 1960s to prevent police from brutalizing and murdering black people, and stood up against murder and continuing heavy repression from the government as over the next few years the BPP grew into a powerful revolutionary force throughout the country. And they did this in unity with revolutionary struggles going on throughout the world. How many people know or remember that the leader of the Black Panther Party, Huey Newton, declared that if they were needed, he was ready to send Black Panthers to fight on the side of the Vietnamese against the U.S.? Clearly, the Black Panthers in their revolutionary days were not the kind of Second Amendment people that Trump likes to talk about. And in recent days, particularly in the context of the mass outpouring against institutionalized racism and police terror, and with the repressive response of the Trump-Pence regime and the threats and attacks by the fascist base of this regime, there have been Black people who have exercised their Second Amendment rights, in some cases raising political demands, such as the call for the World Court to investigate the United States for its murderous oppression of Black people. Even though this does not represent the same kind of revolutionary outlook of the Panthers in their early days, it does involve an important stand. Although both the Vietnamese liberation fighters and the Black Panther Party eventually were taken off the road of revolution, there is still much to learn from their revolutionary heroism at the height of their inspiring struggles. Applying the lessons from previous revolutionary struggles and forces, and going still deeper, here's something worth thinking about. How about masses of Black and brown youth today who, instead of killing each other, are taking up the 5-2-6 basic principles of revolution and are moving as a powerful positive force, working for an actual revolution that will put an end to this oppressive system and bring something much better into being. A revolution based on the new communism and aiming to put an end to all the ways in which people anywhere are exploited, abused, terrorized, brutalized, and slaughtered.
That was Bob Avakian from his piece on revcom.us, Bloated Bag of Fascist Feces, Trump Isn't Tough, Part 2. Who really has heart? At the end of this piece, Bob Avakian mentioned the 5-2-6. This is an important concentration of how people can take up the revolution, and you can find this on the website, revcom.us, the 5-2-6. It's right on the homepage. For those who've watched the show before, you know we've talked about these are 5 deep and defining contradictions of this system, which has a name, capitalism, imperialism, things that cannot be reformed. 5 things: how it oppresses people, women, Black and Latino people, the immigrants, how it destroys the environment, and the wars and crimes against humanity it commits. These are 5 things that cannot be reformed, that people care deeply about, and that's part of the basis for an actual revolution. But Bob Avakian says we have 2 choices. Either we go along with all of this, or we make revolution. I'm shortening it here, but that's essentially the question that's posed. And then there's 6 points of attention for the revolution, which you should go and read. These are 6 points that we live by, we propagate them all over the place, and we're fighting for a world where these 6 points of attention could be real. So this is the 5-2-6, that's what he's referring to. It's how you can take up the revolution wherever you are. And next up, we have a special segment that's along with our theme today on the American Crime Series. Bob Avakian has written that there's 3 things that have to happen for an actual revolution, and one of which is, in order for there to be a real and lasting change for the better, people have to fully confront the actual history of this country and its role in the world up to today, and the terrible consequences of this. Today, the American crime we're going to go into is about My Lai. I'm not going to tell you about My Lai. The film you're about to see does that. I want you to stick with it. Don't avert your eyes from what you see. Don't close your ears to it. Don't fiddle with your computer or adjust your remote. Just go with it. My Lai.
You may have heard this story, but you may not know its secret. On Saturday morning, March 16th, 1968, 100 soldiers from Charlie Company, U.S. Army Americal Division, entered and took over My Lai, a small hamlet in Vietnam's countryside. As one soldier described it, quote, "We met no resistance, and I only saw 3 captured weapons. It was just like any other Vietnamese village, old papasans, women, and kids," end quote. "The order we were given was to kill and destroy everything that was in the village," another soldier later testified. "It was clearly explained that there were to be no prisoners, and those orders were obeyed." Here's how Nick Terse, author of Kill Anything That Moves, The Real American War in Vietnam, describes the scene. Over 4 hours, members of Charlie Company methodically slaughtered more than 500 unarmed victims. They faced no opposition. They even took a quiet break to eat lunch in the midst of the carnage. Along the way, they also raped women and young girls, mutilated the dead, systematically burned homes, and fouled the area's drinking water, end quote. At one point, dozens of villagers were forced into a ditch. Quote, "I began shooting them all. I guess I shot maybe 25 or 20 people in the ditch," one GI later recounted. Men, women, and children, and babies. A baby crawling away from the ditch was grabbed and thrown back into the ditch and shot. After the slaughter, Charlie Company reported that 128, quote, "enemy combatants," end quote, were killed in a fierce firefight. They were commended for their bravery by the highest commander in Vietnam, General Westmoreland, who called their day's work, quote, "an astounding action that dealt the enemy a heavy blow," end quote. But wait a minute, they didn't know? 100 American GIs spent an entire day murdering 500 men, women, and children, not one of them an enemy fighter, and military command did not know that's what they had done? The answer to that is simple. They did know. They knew exactly what had happened. And therein lies the secret of My Lai. A helicopter pilot named Hugh Thompson, Jr., seeing the slaughter from the air, had landed his helicopter in the middle of the carnage, ordered his crew to aim their weapons at the murdering GIs, and flew 16 villagers to their safety. He then immediately wrote a report on what he had witnessed. His company commander threw the report in the trash before issuing a commendation for Captain Ernest Medina, the commanding officer of Charlie Company. Then another helicopter pilot, Ron Ridenour, wrote letters to the military command and to Congress demanding an investigation. He had heard stories of the massacre from several Charlie Company GIs. 2 investigations were conducted. First, Colonel Oral Henderson, who had shit-canned Hugh Thompson's report, talked to a few of the GIs involved and concluded that only 20 civilians had been inadvertently killed during the, quote, "firefight," end quote. Then Major Colin Powell led a second year-long investigation. His conclusion, quote, "In direct refutation of this portrayal is the fact that relations between Americal Division soldiers and the Vietnamese people are excellent," end quote. It took almost 2 years for the truth of the My Lai massacre to be revealed, and it was only because of journalist Seymour Hersh's reporting that 26 officers and enlisted men of Charlie Company were eventually court-martialed a year later. All were either acquitted or pardoned, except for one, Lieutenant William Calley. Calley was convicted of premeditated murder of not fewer than 20 people and sentenced to life in prison. But President Nixon immediately ordered him released from jail. William Calley served 3 years under house arrest. In 1971, he was praised as a hero in a hit record, the Battle Hymn of Lieutenant Calley. Hugh Thompson had saved the lives of 16 villagers at My Lai and testified at the trials. He was publicly vilified, threatened with court-martial for aiming weapons at U.S. soldiers, and was hounded over the next 10 years of military service. 30 years after My Lai, in 1998, he was awarded a medal for, quote, "bravery not involving direct contact with the enemy," end quote. In the decades since, My Lai, if it is even mentioned, is portrayed in the United States as a horrible, regrettable tragedy, born of the chaos and confusion that was the Vietnam War. As Colin Powell said in 2004, when he was U.S. Secretary of State during the Iraq War, Quote, "In war, these things happen every now and again, but they are still to be deplored." End quote. But the secret of My Lai isn't just that the massacre was known about at the highest levels of the military and government, and that they covered it up, then exonerated all of the murderers, even praising them. No. The secret of My Lai is this. It was policy. My Lai was, in essence, just another day at the office. It was an operation, not an aberration, as Ron Ridenour would write years later. And when it comes to mass murder of civilians by the United States military in Vietnam, it was merely the tip of the iceberg. In the wake of the exposure of the My Lai massacre, the Army secretly launched an inquiry by a team of officers called the War Crimes Working Group. For the next 5 years, until the end of the war in 1975, that team sent monthly reports all the way up the chain of command. And what did they find? 9,000 pages of evidence revealed hundreds of atrocities committed by U.S. troops, including several massacres on the scale of My Lai. Thousands of incidents of rape, torture, murder, and wanton destruction of villages. And what did the military do with that information? They buried it. They buried it so deep that it wasn't until 1990 that researchers stumbled on the reports in an obscure room of the National Archives. They buried it because terrorizing the population of Vietnam, the people President Lyndon Johnson called pissants, and soldiers at every level called gooks, was indeed U.S. policy. Terry Whitmore grew up in a Memphis ghetto and joined the Marines right out of high school. After 6 months of combat in Vietnam, he deserted to Sweden. In his memoir, Terry describes what happened one day when his company, Bravo Company, came upon a village with a suspected sniper in it. "Well, men," the captain said, "there it is. Level it." Terry goes on. Very calm, no emotion in his voice. He meant it. Just level it. We had a bunch of real go-getters who didn't have to be ordered again. Eyeballs bulging, safeties off. These cats were more than ready to go at it. Marching right through this village. No resistance, not a shot. We didn't even see a weapon all that day, other than our own, of course. First gun team was at the village chief's hooch. Mainly women were inside. The M16 machine gun was set up outside the hooch, back about 10 yards, aimed right across the front door. A Marine with his M16 went in and forced these people out of the hooch at gunpoint, just running them out and into the fire of the M60. A complete slaughter. Every single one of those Vietnamese people were cut down. Not one had a chance to escape. That took care of most of the adult inhabitants of the village. The rest of that day was spent burning the hooches and killing anyone who was left. This is my company, Bravo.
I'm here in our garage with David Zeiger, who just created that incredible film of My Lai. David, welcome to the RNL Show.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Great. David, as you know, has created other segments of American crime for the RNL Revolution Nothing Less show. David is a filmmaker. One of his films is called Sir No Sir. You can find that online. It's a very important film on the resistance movement among GIs. And as a young man, just a few weeks ago, David was a part of the coffee house movement, the GI support movement that took place in coffee houses all across the country. David was at a movement outside of Fort Hood. And I'm also here on Skype with Carl Dix, who's a revolutionary, follower of Bob Avakian. And Carl Dix, some of you may know, was in the U.S. military, drafted into the military, and when he was at Fort Lewis, he led a group of 6 GIs, including himself, the Fort Lewis 6, to refuse to go to Vietnam, for which he served 2 years at Leavenworth. Welcome, Carl.
Thank you for having me on, Andy.
Okay. So I just first have to say that I have now seen that segment on My Lai a few times, and every time I see it, it just makes me filled with emotion and makes me so fucking angry. But I think we should get into the film, and maybe, David, you could set up the film and bring out some of how we have been discussing this as important to do to bring out the true history and meaning of this war.
The Five Bloods that Spike Lee made and was released a few weeks ago on Netflix. It's the first film to deal with black GIs in Vietnam. And right there is an important point, because there have been over 200 films made by Hollywood about the Vietnam War, and not a single one of them has dealt with the issue in any way of black GIs during the war. So Spike's film has been hailed, on a certain level, rightly so, as finally dealing with the experience of black GIs during the Vietnam War. And for those who haven't seen the film, it follows four black veterans who returned to Vietnam to find and bring home the remains of their squad leader, and also a cache of gold that they had hidden during the war. And that pretty much sets up the film. It's a very important film to kind of get into, exactly because it's been hailed. It's been hailed by critics. It's a popular film. A lot of people are watching it. A lot of people are seeing and viewing this film as being the definitive picture of the experience of black GIs in Vietnam, and Spike himself has promoted it that way. The film begins with some very stirring moments, some of which are fairly familiar, but moments of documentary moments of Muhammad Ali explaining why he refused to go to Vietnam, Stokely Carmichael, several other people talking about the fact that blacks shouldn't fight in Vietnam on some level, and then it kind of sets it up from there, and in doing that, it kind of creates this idea that, okay, now we're going to find out what really the experience was of black GIs. And that's where the problems start with the film. The thing that to me is very significant, right in the beginning of the film, is within 10 minutes, one of the guys, I think it's Otis, just comments offhand that they're sitting around talking about what their treatment and what happened to them, and he says, yeah, and they called us baby killers, and that kind of is a throwaway line even in the film, but it is, in my mind, one of the most significant moments in the film, and the reason is, first of all, it's a lie. People didn't call Vietnam vets baby killers. People didn't spit on them when they came home. People didn't drive them out of universities or hound them on the street, which is we have been told over and over and over again in the past 50 years that this is what happened during the Vietnam War. And this mythology, this lie has a very important purpose. It was developed and promoted by the most reactionary elements in this country, people who wanted to completely reverse the understanding that had been reached by millions of people, including hundreds of thousands of soldiers, of GIs, that the Vietnam War was an imperialist war, that it was a genocidal war. 3 million Vietnamese people were killed. 2 million of those were civilians. It was a brutal attempt by the United States to control Vietnam for its larger global purposes. All of that has been buried under the idea and the lie that what really happened in the Vietnam War was soldiers went there and they fought hard and they fought loyally, and they came home and the anti-war movement spat on them, called them baby killers, vilified them, and just destroyed their lives. And this is a myth that has been so prominent and has completely obfuscated what actually happened in the Vietnam War. And for Spike to start his movie with one of the characters making that comment sets it up very much as a movie that's not going to tell the truth, that's not going to tell what really happened in Vietnam. And it kind of goes from there.
You know, Spike weaves a very, complex story. He weaves like you're saying, he begins with Stokely. He throws lots of footage in there. He gets you emotionally involved in these soldiers. And his view is, he's not just saying that's all that happened. He's got a lot of different things in there. But there is an essential line in this film, or really several lines that actually say, we were going over speaking here of black GIs in particular, but I think of black GIs, but also I heard the same thing from Latino GIs. We had to go we went over there to fight for freedom for these people against the communist menace, but our fight should have been here at home against our own ruling class, or for our own freedom, as more how people put it. We have a fight for freedom here, but we shouldn't be fighting over there. And this covered over the fact that as the war progressed, people and the soldiers themselves began to understand that they weren't over there fighting for the Vietnamese people's freedom. They were fighting to suppress and oppress the Vietnamese people, and that the Vietnamese people were waging a heroic war and kicking their ass, which is a very important lesson that, for people today to actually get hold of. So the film reverses, this is one of the themes I want us to talk about, it reverses the role of black GIs in the film. In other words, black GIs, there's never been a force in the U.S. military as revolutionary-minded as a section of the black soldiers in Vietnam. And then many white soldiers were part of this too, such that it's even part of why the war had to be, U.S. had to withdraw from the war, because there was almost a disintegration of the U.S. military forces. So I'd like us to get into that aspect of the film, picking up on what David said about how this offhanded remark around in a bar room that introduces the film just throws this out there and doesn't throw out an opposing point of view to that. Right. Nobody says, oh, that's not true. Carl, did you want to comment on this?
Yeah, I think this is an important point that Dave brought up here that we do need to get into, because, look, when I got drafted and got my orders to go to Vietnam, I had to figure out, is this a war that I should be a part of fighting? And in trying to get at that, one of the things I did is I talked to a lot of GIs, especially black GIs, who had been in Vietnam. And I got a whole bunch of different kinds of things. But one thing that came through from a number of them was that you go over in this war and every Vietnamese person is your enemy. Men, women, and children. And what they meant by that was that you were fighting a war where you treated them all as your enemies, and you killed people indiscriminately. That this is what was going on in this war. And the other thing that I learned was that there are a lot of black GIs who learned that this was a war not for them, and develop some solidarity with the Vietnamese people who were fighting this war from their experience over there. People who said, I got my first Black history lesson when I was in Vietnam, and learning from these Vietnamese people that they were fighting to free their country and being challenged by them, including being challenged by VC fighters who spared their lives.
Wait a second, Carl. You just made a very important point on many of the GIs, black GIs, said they learned their first black history from the VC, that are the Viet Cong, which were the North Vietnamese freedom fighters. They were the South Vietnamese, actually, who were siding with the North Vietnamese. This was a civil war in Vietnam between the North and the South. The South had been supported by the French and then by the U.S. It was a puppet government. The North was a communist government that was led by a leader, Ho Chi Minh. And so the VC had a certain approach to this. In fact, there's a character in the film called Hanoi Hannah. Right, and she, you can see her doing, what the critics says propaganda, but actually she was telling the U.S. troops a lot of the true history of the, and arguing with them not to be part of the war against Vietnam.
Well, yeah, I mean, actually, the point about the black education, black history education, I think is important because it's a big aspect of the film, is this idea that the black soldiers have fought for the United States in every single war. They fought hard. They were, and they came home to discrimination, to Jim Crow, and including during the Vietnam War to the oppression that was being launched against black people all over the country at the time. But there's in Spike's film, he actually references this, and he does it in a way that I think it's important to look at the way he puts it and the way it was being put at that time by leaders such as Stokely Carmichael, who was a leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, who toured around the country in the middle part of around 1966, 67, giving speeches on campuses all over the country about why black people should not fight in Vietnam and should be on the side of the Vietnamese people. And he tells the same story when he's telling these speeches that is told in Spike's film. In Spike's film, it's told by Norm, who's the squad leader, who is unfortunately probably purposely named Storm and Norman, which is a reference, by the way, to Norman Schwarzkopf, who was one of the U.S. generals in the, was he in Vietnam? But he was in, he was in Vietnam, and he was one of the main, he was the main general during the Iraq War. And it's, and this is the name that Spike has given the squad leader in the film, and I think part of the reason is because his picture of the squad leader was that this guy is the hero. He's a brilliant fighter. He fights hard, but at the same time, he knows that black people should be getting justice. But the way Norman tells the story, and it's Spike telling the story through him, of Crispus Attucks, who was supposedly the first person to be killed in the Revolutionary War, and he was black. The way Norman tells it is that this is a matter of pride. This should be a matter of pride for black people to know that it was a black person who was the first person killed in the war for independence in this country. But let's listen to how Stokely Carmichael tells that story back in 1966, right around the same time.
Our problem has been, as black people, we've always been concerned about white America, never about us. And what we've always thought is that white America equal the same interest as us. That is not true. We must now be concerned with us. Let me give you some examples. We always want to prove what good Americans we are. The very first man to die for the War of Independence in this country was a black man named Crispus Attucks. Crispus Attucks. He was a fool. Because here he was dying for white folk freedom, and millions of his brothers were enslaved in the very country. Oh, but we wanted to prove what great Americans we were. We begged the white folk to let us fight in the War of Independence, and they said no. So we organized ourselves in bands of armies, training ourselves with our bare foot to prove to the white folk what great Americans we were. Please let us fight, white folk. And finally they came and inspected our troops and said, good niggers, you can fight. And they had us fighting the Indians. Like fools, we should have teamed up with the Indians and take care of you know who.
I want to say something about this because in addition to what I learned from some of the blacks who had been in Vietnam, what Stokely Carmichael had to say back then also influenced my decision to refuse orders to go to Vietnam. I remember him saying there's no good reason for a black man to kill yellow men for this white man system. But I also remember the Black Panther Party and what it had to say which went beyond there's no reason for blacks to go to Vietnam. Huey P. Newton actually put out a statement saying he was ready to send Black Panthers to go to Vietnam to fight on the side of the National Liberation Front, the Vietnamese People's Liberation Organization, fighting to liberate Vietnam, because he was clear that it was the same struggle. It wasn't just that black people had their struggle over there and the Vietnamese had their struggle over there, but this was the same struggle against the same imperialist system. And this not only helped to strengthen me in my decision to refuse to go to Vietnam, but it spurred me to move to what do we do about this system? And it's part of why when I came out of Leavenworth after doing my time, I went looking for the revolution so that I could get into it to be a part of taking down this system. So I think that motion from Muhammad Ali to Stokely Carmichael to Huey Newton and the Black Panther Party was an important part of it. And that motion had its resonance among blacks in Vietnam.
Well, I think it's important that arc that you talked about, and that after that, we'll get you got involved in when you went from the stockade in Fort Lewis to Leavenworth and becoming an actual revolutionary, which you've still been working for and which is still urgently needed. But look, I just want to stay a little bit longer on this one aspect of what we want to get into on this film that David, you said earlier, the question of the role of the black GIs, that there was actually a revolutionary-minded section of the GIs who were in rebellion, and that role is not in this film, that purports, that represents, that Spike has said, involves the very different and contradictory views of the different soldiers, including he has the great actor Lindo playing a Ahab character with his MAGA hat.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that was so disappointing to me and striking to me about the film. Again, the context of this is that this film is presented both by Spike and by critics and everyone as being a fairly definitive picture of the experience of black GIs in the war. And certainly each one of those characters in the film, and when you see the film, you'll see, they all have different stories and different backstories, et cetera. And all the way from, sympathetic on some level to the Vietnamese people to this kind of rabid anti-Vietnamese character played by Delroy Lindo. And Spike has said he wanted to show that the variety of experience and the variety of views of black people. But what he left out is so significant because there are so many things that thousands and thousands of GIs did during the war. This is not a matter of opinion. It's not a matter of, I think the film should have been X, Y, Z. There was actually, things happening at the time that he, along with every film that's ever been made about Vietnam in Hollywood, has completely ignored. He could have had a character who, as Carl was saying, fragged his officer. The Army, I think, has 200 documented cases of officers being killed by their own men for the crime of sending them out to fight the Vietnamese. He could have deserted. There were tens of thousands of GIs who deserted. Terry Whitmore, who was in the piece about My Lai, his experience was very common. There were hundreds of deserters in Sweden. There were thousands in Canada. These weren't cowards. These were people who left because they did not want to be part of this war. He could have disappeared there was a place in Saigon called Seoul Alley. This was a neighborhood in Saigon that was run by American GI deserters, all African American. They had bars, they had restaurants, and there would be, at any time, there would be hundreds of GIs who were AWOL or deserted, who were hiding out in Seoul Alley, which the U.S. military couldn't get anywhere near. He could have joined an organization. There were organizations in Vietnam and in the States when people came home, such as GIs United, in which thousands of GIs organized against the war, found ways to participate in demonstrations, put out over 500 underground newspapers that were put out by military, by GIs in every branch of the service. And this was led often by black GIs, because they saw better than anyone the connection between the Vietnamese people that they were there to kill and their fight back home. It was very explicit. It wasn't simply a matter of, I'm over here fighting for the man, and I should be fighting the man back home. That's true. That was a big part of the sentiment. But there were thousands of GIs that went way beyond that. He could have had a character who went home and joined Vietnam Veterans Against the War, which was on just about every campus in the country. Testified, had the Winter Soldier investigation, where he testified about war crimes that they committed or that they saw being committed. And ultimately had a demonstration where they threw their medals onto the Capitol steps. I mean, these things happened. These are things that GIs did during the Vietnam War. And when you're making a film, I mean, I think it's justifiable to say to Spike Lee, if you're going to purport to tell the story of black GIs in Vietnam, and you completely eliminate those type of GIs, the people that came to that understanding and that took those kind of actions, then you're telling a lie.
So point one in critiquing this film is that this obliterates the history of the radical and revolutionary-minded black GIs, which is very, very important to understand. And if the film was about something else, that's fine, but Spike's whole justification for the Delroy Lindo character in this film is that, well, I wanted to present all the views. Black people are variegated people. But one point of view he doesn't put in here. We're going to get into that again, because there's another point of view that he doesn't get into in this film, and it is consistent with the Rambo model of the Vietnam films, which is the Vietnamese people in this film are not people. It is a cowboy and Indian film, from the trivial to where the Vietnamese in this film, gangsters, can have submachine guns and mow down these GIs who haven't fired a gun in 40 years, and they can just pick one up for the first time and hit somebody point blank, but that's not the essence of the question. The novelist Viet Thanh Nguyen, who's won the Pulitzer Prize for his book, The Sympathizer, said this about Spike's movie: making a Vietnam War movie in this classic mold, except with black men, Spike Lee cannot overcome the imperialism that is American as slavery and genocide. He said, look, I'm making a demand that we have to recognize decolonization and anti-imperialism are impossible if we keep reiterating the imperial country's point of view, even if from a minority perspective. The Vietnamese here are cartoon characters. They are archetypes. They are background for the exploits and the trauma of these black GIs. That is also not acceptable. I think we should just spend a little bit of time on this. And
see, that's important, because the big picture of the war in Vietnam is that the U.S. war in Vietnam is that the U.S. stepped into the shoes of the French colonialists who were trying to hang on to their colonial possession called Vietnam, and got their asses kicked by the Vietnamese resistance. And then the U.S. steps in and tries to hang on to that for Western and American imperialism, and is fought and beaten by the same Vietnamese resistance fighters.
A unit of the regular army. There's no conscription in North Vietnam. All soldiers are volunteers. And behind the army, there's a whole nation at arms.
Đâm thẳng. Đâm. Một bước. Tiến. Đâm thẳng.
This then is a people's war, the total mobilization of all human and material resources. The old, the young, the peasants and the workers, all are ready to fight and die in defense of their country.
I've seen Charlie, Luke the Gook, whatever you want to call him, NVA, right there laying down as I walk by. I looked at him, he looks at me. He's going about my business. This man didn't do me nothing. He ain't hurt me in no type of way. He ain't hurt none of my black people, none of my families. So why should I shoot him?
I feel all black men should be exempt from military duty anyway. Because
Right on.
the only place a black man should fight is where he's being oppressed. And I'm not being oppressed in Japan, I'm not being oppressed in Vietnam, and I'm not being oppressed in Pakistan.
Guys were coming from all over the country. So you're getting people coming in with different information about the Black Power struggle at that time and, black unity and, feeling real good about yourself. And you began to really question what you were doing in Vietnam. I remember one day the first sergeant was talking about gooks. Show you how naive I was. I didn't know that gook was a racial slur. I didn't really understand that. One day he was talking about gooks, and I remember a light went off in my head, and I said, wow, a gook is the same thing as a nigger.
Penultimate moment in the film is the firefight where Norman gets killed. That's in December of 1971. It's actually explicitly then. By 1971, the GI movement had reached such proportions that it was almost impossible, and this is true, it was almost impossible for the army to muster troops to go out and fight the Vietnamese. People were refusing in massive amounts and resisting in so many ways that 1971 was when Nixon, who was president at that time, realized we have to get the soldiers out of Vietnam. I think there was a survey that the Senate ran, excuse me, of ground troops in Vietnam that showed that somewhere over 50% had engaged in some form of resistance to the war. And to ignore that and to set this thing at the time that it was set and to have that completely out of the picture, just it's, as Carl said, it's not acceptable. I mean, especially again from Spike Lee, a film that's purported to be the definitive story of black GIs.
I mentioned before cowboys and Indians, and I was realizing that these are stories that I grew up on, but many of the younger people don't know that generations in this country were raised on films that were made about the heroic struggle of the cowboys carrying out a genocide against the native people. So when I was saying this was a cartoon version of that, what I was referring to, there's nothing funny about it. It's not a cartoon. I was referring to the fact that the Vietnamese get mowed down in this film, and they're literally props for the Five Bloods instead of being whole characters, and you don't get any sense of what they were fighting for their freedom. In fact, they're gangsters in this film and double-cross people. And so there's a version that it's just very slick and, or I might even say coarse, but there's a slickness to Spike Lee here, where he doesn't say America was great, we're just the good guys. He presents a complex picture of a really messed up war, messed up situation, all of this, but you still have this message that America could be, and these guys are good guys, these Five Bloods, and who have been destroyed by this war, and never mind the nature of that war and the conclusion that David was just pointing out, that 50% of the GIs were rebelling against this war, and that some of them had really revolutionary consciousness, and that is so important for this time. But I want to go to one other point. There's a story in this film. It's one of the two emotional centers of the film. One is this character that you mentioned before, Stormin' Norman, who dies early in the film and then becomes the center of the film for one of the five bloods, played by Delroy Lindo, Paul, who basically is suffering terribly from PTSD and goes off, and he's got a MAGA hat and all of this, and is rehabilitated at the end of the film. But there's another emotional story here. In one of the characters, his name is Otis. When he goes back to Vietnam with this crew, he's setting up how they can go find the gold by going back to his old lover, who was actually a prostitute at that time, and with whom he had a child. And you are very much drawn in to the story between them. And I just have to say, this sentimental, I can't pronounce it, but this romanticization, okay, maybe I can do that word, of these relationships between the GIs and Vietnamese women. It wasn't just black GIs, it was black and white GIs. This concentrated a very messed up, imperialist, male chauvinist exploitation of these Vietnamese women as human beings. And so I just think it'd be important, maybe Carl, if you want to, I just think we would be really remiss if we didn't talk about this aspect of the film, because how Spike tells this story, how much he draws you into it, and how he resolves it is really fucked up. I don't know how to say it any other way.
Yeah, I think this is an important point to get into too, because this story is used to cover over the reality of the relationship between GIs, black and white, and the women in Vietnam. And I'll just start with what a bunch of black GIs who had been in the Nam told me about why I should go over there, you know, and not refuse my orders. And they said, look, man, you could get all the weed and women you want. And what they were basically saying was that the Vietnamese women were part of the spoils of war that the US warriors would get by being there. And this was not at all a relationships based upon mutual respect, equality, and love. It was a really dehumanization of the Vietnamese people. And it's what imperialist armies do, including the US imperialist army. They set up brothels, they have women who are at the beck and call of their GIs, and in many cases are brutally dealt with. There's a slang term for GIs in Vietnam who had sex with women and then murdered them. They developed a slang term for that. They called you a double veteran if you do that. Now think about how often that happened, that a slang term developed around it. Think about that. Think about the fact that there were tens of thousands of children who were born out of the liaisons between US GIs and Vietnamese women, and terms that the Vietnamese developed to refer to them. I probably can't pronounce this right. It's something like Tre Bu Doi, which is called dusts of life. And it refers to vagrant and street children, but it moved over to refer to the children of these Amur Asian children from these liaisons, because they were largely tossed aside by their family, ostracized in Vietnam. And then you have this one case in the movie where this guy reconnects with the woman that he had a relationship with. She actually refers to herself. She says, I was your whore. But you can see their bonds that develop. He meets the child that grew from this. They hug each other. They profess their love. And that's used to cover over this much larger reality, which is women being made the spoils of war for the imperialist army, which was the widespread reality in Vietnam.
Carl, this is very important what you just brought out, and that people should just know at the, and I know we're doing a lot of spoilers of this film, but you know what, this film is spoiling quite a bit of consciousness that people need to have. At the end, Otis, who's a very likable character in many ways, has this big hug this big hug with his daughter by this marriage. And you have to, by this relationship. On the terms of the relationship, you have to say, oh, well, after all this, she's finally getting that affection and he's getting a completion. But that emotional journey that you've been taken on obscures this larger reality that you're speaking of, which is all these women who are hurt. And I want to just say one thing to people who are coming at this, from a sense of really tremendous hatred of what has been done to black people in this country, who might say that, and do feel with justification, that what Thomas Jefferson did to his slave girl, Sally Hemings, and fathered children with him and with her, and how he treated her and the offspring as slaves and never treated her as a human being, how fucked up that was. Well, you can't have it that way and then go watch the Spike Lee film and say it was okay what these black GIs did to this woman. You can't have it both ways, and this is the importance of being for the emancipation of humanity and the liberation of all women, and not for just my people. Because you see, that's where, if you come from there, you're going to find yourself at odds with other people and privilege that at the expense, and 9 times out of 10, at women who are seen as the spoils of war and, frankly, the spoils of everything, and are treated in a way that is, for us as followers of the new communism, is at the heart of our revolution. It's a very key thing. The liberation of women is part of the emancipation of all of humanity. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground, and we haven't even covered everything you could talk about in this film and related to the movements of resistance in Vietnam among the black GIs as well as back here at home. But let's just, each of you want to make a closing comment?
Yeah, I think it's important for people to see this film. I mean, a lot of people are seeing it, but I hope your audience, our audience here, watches the film and also watches it with a critical eye and questions a lot of the assumptions that are in the film. And not to blow my own horn, but for people to also watch Sir No Sir, which you can stream on Amazon Prime, to see the story that is not in Spike's film.
Carl?
Yeah, I mean, Dave made the point that I wanted to make, because look, there's reality to what the Vietnam War was about, the role black GIs played. And look, Spike Lee's a skillful filmmaker. He can touch your heartstrings, he can move you places. But in the midst of that going on, step back and look at the actual reality. Dave's work can take you to that. There are other ways to get to it. And look at that reality and bring that to bear on this movie and see the difference between the two.
Yeah, I agree with both of those things. We have brought a lot of different aspects of this film to light. There's more for you to look at. One of the things that disturbed me on a really profound level is all through the film, these 5 characters, the Frenchman who helps them find the gold, the Vietnamese, everybody's money grubbing, everybody's looking out for themselves, everybody's fighting with each other. And I kind of think Spike Lee probably thinks, well, I'm keeping it real the way a lot of hip hop keeps it real about who's going to get paid. And then at the end, he resolves this money grubbing with some charity. And this is so different than what so many of the soldiers who came back from Vietnam represented and what they did when they came back. So before we close out this segment, I want to thank you, David, for the American Crime on My Lai. I want to thank you for creating some of these American Crime series, and for the film Sir No Sir, and for being here in our garage and taking part in this interview.
It's my pleasure. It's kind of hot, but you know.
Okay, and Carl, thank you for being with us on the computer here on Skype, and we'll have you back on soon.
Thank you for having me on, and you know how to reach me.
Okay, so watch this Dewey Canyon 3, protest by Vietnam veterans against the war.
To smile sometimes In April of 1971, just 5 years after Howard Levy and Donald Duncan's lone acts of protest, thousands of Vietnam veterans against the war converged on Washington, D.C. and threw their medals onto the Capitol steps.
We don't want to fight anymore, but if we have to fight again, it'll be to take these steps.
Okay, so I'm back here in this garage studio with Luan and with Sansara. That was quite a conversation and quite a segment. I hope people got a lot out of it. Before I turn to both of you, I just want to return your attention to the opening American crime on My Lai and the picture you saw. I'm going to put up a poster of that picture. This poster was titled And Babies. It's a very famous poster. It's one of the great examples of political art that came out of that period against the Vietnam War. This was put together by a group called the Art Workers Coalition. And when they put this poster up, it's the picture you saw earlier, but there had been an interview with somebody one of the soldiers who had participated in My Lai by the newscaster Mike Wallace, whose son Chris Wallace is now on Fox. But Mike Wallace asked this soldier, how many people he had killed there, and he said, well, I had an automatic weapon and I just sprayed it. He said, did you kill women and children? He said, yes. And children? Yes. And babies? And the soldier answered, and babies. So they made this poster that had the question up top that you're looking at now that says, question, and babies, answer, and babies. And it was something to have to look at this artwork in the way we did at the beginning of this show, to dwell on just what kind of depravity produced this, and that it was actual policy and widespread. When this poster was being made, the Museum of Modern Art, a very prestigious museum in New York, was going to distribute it. They were going to do funds for it. But when the governor of New York, who was a liberal Republican, there were such things in the 1960s, Nelson Rockefeller, saw this, he reportedly hit the ceiling and they pulled all the funding for the poster, which of course, because of the movements that existed at the time, made this an even bigger deal. And it was in the protest against that happening that I had first learned about it as, yes, a young person. So with that, I want to come back to Luan and to Sansara, and what did you guys get from this, and where do you think we need to go?
The poster that you just showed, the imagery that we began with, and what got brought alive, which has been buried. I mean, what this country has done to people all over the world, what this country did just to the people in Vietnam. Just in one country, one small country, 2-3 million people killed. What we heard from Carl, from David, the footage, and that American crime, I don't think you can be the same after seeing this, and I hope that people who view this actually let themselves really process this, because this is it's history, but it's also ongoing. This is what this country still means to people around the world, where it occupies, where it ravages people's homelands. This is America.
I really agree with that, and I just kind of think that there's a lot to learn from, what was the actual history? The real resistance that people actually did, the real fighting back, the whole humanity of the Vietnamese people and actually what they did. That is completely erased. You think about it in the schools, it's you kind of learn, maybe the U.S. lost. You don't really learn anything, about what actually happened. And it was... this is just really important for people to spread and actually share and talk about and actually get into, what really did happen there, and learn from that, but then also recognize that this is a fight, what will actually come out of this, and what will actually be understood about what happened there and what's happening now.
Well, just one thought for myself is, when you think about a period like this where a whole section of the U.S. military was refusing to fight, as David brought out, maybe half the forces in Vietnam, where people were taking up revolution, where that was spreading throughout this country, we wouldn't be here. Our revolutionary movement today comes out of that. Bob Avakian was very active in the anti-war movement when he was a student at Berkeley. He got involved with the Black Panther Party in the early days, and you heard that in his opening talk you heard him read. He brought out that Huey P. Newton had said, if the Vietnamese people call on us, we'll send a battalion to Vietnam. That's the kind of spirit that needs to be out there today. And more than a spirit, we now have what we didn't have in the 1960s, which is a strategy for an actual revolution. We have the leadership for that revolution. We have a plan for what would come after the revolution. But what we don't have is enough people right now to make this a compelling and critical force in the political landscape of this country. That's a big part of this show. We are trying to reach people with that. And part of how we reach people is having segments like we just did today that reveal the real history of this, not just the history of the oppression, but the history of resistance and rebellion. People say revolution's not possible in this country. Well, if you'd actually had an organized force for revolution in the 1960s, it might just have been possible. Avakian has cited several times that Henry Kissinger, who was the Secretary of State and the leading force in foreign policy, had said that for 2 years we didn't have the political initiative, but the people had the political initiative. And you got a taste of that in the last 6 weeks, not in a revolutionary movement, but in a movement around Black lives. This is the import of doing this segment. This is why we stretched out and took the time, especially for people like you, Luan, in the sense of being younger. I mean, I know you've read a lot of history and since, but that people need to know this history to understand just how rotten this place is, how it's not the good guys, but also what they don't know is how close we could have come in that time and maybe gone all the way and now still need to go to. And that's why we're here for, because we believe that could happen again, but now that with the strategy, the leadership, and the science for this, we could really do it. So that's the import of this segment. But there were other things in here that I know you guys were talking about, particularly around the character of Tien and Otis and their relationship and their daughter. So I'd just like us to close out with just a couple of words on that and what it provoked in the discussion we had in the break, and then we're going to close out this episode.
Yeah, I just want to say, I think what you just said about what the possibility that's also revealed by the conversation you guys had and the urgency of fighting for that now. It's really important. It's really important. The other thing that we were talking about that really hit me in the film, but in the conversation, it actually brought it alive even more fully, especially when Carl said this story of GIs who raped and then killed, or had sex with and then killed Vietnamese women. And happened often enough that there was a slang term for it, a double veteran. That concentrates so much of the misogyny, the hatred of women, the patriarchy that's woven into this country, that's woven into this system, that's woven into the ideology that glues together their fighting forces, treating women as the spoils of war, all of this. So I was really glad that this was a part of the critique. I know that you said when you were talking about it, this is a hallmark of the revolution we're making. And it is a hallmark of the work BA has done with the new communism to actually see even more deeply. This has been a part of communist revolution before, but even more deeply how central the fight to liberate all of women is to the fight to emancipate all of humanity, to fully liberate women. And that's a central and driving force. It's not a side issue. And I thought this movie really needed to be taken to task for the damage it does in the romanticization and the covering over of that relationship of predation and oppression. And I was glad that came out. And Luan and I have been working on it. Maybe you will say a little bit about, maybe we could both say a little bit more about. This is a burning question today, the oppression of women and the question of whether there will be a radical resolution to the position of women in an enslaving way, a reactionary way, or a revolutionary way, a liberating way. And so there's a lot of attacks on women's rights right now that actually are more intense than they've been in a long time, and yet far little understood. And so this is something we've been talking about. Maybe you want to say a little bit about. We're going to be doing some segments in the coming weeks on this.
We're putting some attention to this because it needs to be talked about, especially now. There's a lot, we've had years of people kind of living within, like actually having, right after you had this amazing liberating movement, like with the women rising up, the right to abortion was won. So much was won through this process. And you have all these people who have lived and grown up having this as something that's available, birth control, abortion. And in this, there still has been the oppression of women. There still has been the shame that women grow up with, and just being a girl and a young girl or a young person trying to figure out your identity in this world. And we're putting some attention to this because there actually is a deep fight that needs to be fought around, are women actually going to be freed or not, And this is something that's really sharply coming to head with the assault with fascism and with white supremacy. You saw, The Handmaid's Tale come out in the past few years, and if you haven't heard of it, look it up. It's on Hulu. And this is something that people have to get a deep understanding of, that there is a real reactionary, or what we call reactionary, ugly, repressive future that actually is being fought for right now. And what we do now has everything to do with, is that going to be the future, or is it going to be something liberating? And this is what we're talking about and what we want to get into in the course of this show, and actually get into more on the streets and here in studio. So.
All right, so that's going to be coming up soon, in either next week or in the next couple of weeks. Watch for it. And as we said at the top of the show, there have been some serious repressive moves, really major moves towards fascism that were concentrated in Portland. And so go to revcom.us to read about that. That's it for this episode on July 23rd, 2020 of the RNL Revolution Nothing Less show. We look forward to seeing you next time.
Andy just said it, but I'm back to underscore it, because since we finished this episode, the situation has grown even more dangerous. Donald Trump has sent a paramilitary federal force into Portland, soon to Chicago, and he's threatening cities across this country. They have snatched people up in unidentified vehicles. They're detaining people without identifying themselves. They are maiming and hospitalizing people, and they're doing all of this against the explicit request of even highly repressive state and local governments. This is not, as many people are saying, political theater. This is a major escalation towards a more openly terroristic form of rule in this country, towards all-out fascism. We are covering this at our website, revcom.us, and I'm here to urge you to go and read what we are covering there. We're writing about this, and we will continue to do so. Read what's there, spread what you learn, and join with the efforts to resist and to oppose this escalation towards fascism, which we are also covering. Revcom.us, and we'll see you next week.